Okay.
I am planning on just getting figure out what
Sorry. No, you're fine.
just for good chumps, I guess. Yeah. It's close.
There's also white wine as well. But yeah, if you want me to open with you, I can.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I actually do really like it. Yeah, I don't believe
Hi, Fee.
I do get
Sit all the way in front.
I need to figure out the I've been meaning to like ask Dr. Reese, but I don't like the email like, hey, is your department dying? I would hope that we're not. I don't know. Because if I were to do grad school, I know there's all these I know I work well. I would probably do that, yeah. Even though like a lot of my interests lie in history, I like to see the just professor. I really like Kobe anthropology.
Do you want me to set the chair over there?
Well, I couldn't get there. They moved chairs. I don't know why, but I didn't want to sit
Oh, Dr. Reese.
Oh, yeah. What do you need?
Here, I'll get away.
The shop itself. Somebody showed up at Tampa there's also
Yeah, I do think that's the one thing we need to solve.
the recording is rolling. Sounds good. Sounds good. And Greg's going to do that.
Yes. Yeah. I'll do that.
What were you doing that you're getting this by It's really funny, and I feel like
Is there a trash can I can grab? Okay, thanks. Sorry.
because like you have no choice.
I have no idea.
You're eating all your meals. I'm sure I can think of it. Yeah.
Ian before showed up. Yeah. He parked his truck out for it to come in.
It also volunteers.
You know, he takes cars. He bought this
Just basically.
that Charger. Yeah, I've heard about that.
Massive. Which is awesome. That's pretty dry.
He fixed it and I guess he finished it in
Really expensive parts.
driving and everything.
That's impressive. That's actually very cool.
He gets all that What if I mess that?
You don't.
I know it's a great coach. We're gonna set the bar high so that you know.
Yeah.
Hey Brad, thanks for coming on.
I just love being outside.
So I think Greg is going to give a welcome.
It's like we're in the night shift.
This last year, they have full-time language.
You gonna sit right there and laugh at me when I make mistakes?
I'll smile. Just kidding.
He's here to gadfly me. My Socratic gadfly, yes.
I would be surprised.
I wouldn't dare.
Just turn it over to me, yeah, Wing, and I'll give the introduction for John.
Whatever you are, sir.
Okay. But it is nice. The experience. But honestly, just the overall experience of being there. I came out there. Someone
I'll find her. Be right back. Welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to Zambros. We are proud to be hosting the first NDSU Humanities Colloquium, and thanks to Tom Easern for kind of getting it going, and a couple other participants, John and Heath. Thank you for helping set this up, and we're excited to fill up our back room again and share knowledge, information. I think afterwards John will take some questions. I wanted to plug our next event that we'll have at Zambros, and that will be Sunday, February 19th at 2 p.m. We're going to be hosting Carol Engelhardt, historian, retired historian from Concordia, author of one of the best histories of Fargo-Moorhead. But his newest work is By the Sweat of His Brow, the R.M. Probstfield family at Oakport Farm, which is a history of the Probstfield farm in our area, and it should be very interesting. So come on down on the 19th at 2 o'clock. I'm sure it'll be fun. And restroom is at the back. Feel free to come up and get coffee, refill your wine quietly during the presentation. I'm sure they won't mind. And right now I'm going to turn it over to Heath Wing so he can introduce our speaker today. Thank you, Heath.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Heath Wing. I'm a Spanish professor over at NDSU. I am going to tell a brief story about Tom real quick. Brad and I do a barbecue every year. I'm from Texas. I like to smoke brisket. Brad likes to smoke pig. No, you don't even smoke it. You just throw it. Yeah, anyways. And that was one of the, I've known Tom, but I haven't known him well, and that was one of the first time I've really had a conversation. I don't know if you remember this, Tom, and that's all right if you don't. But that's when Tom planted the idea to, maybe we should, do some sort of colloquium, like a public event where, scholars in the humanities from NDSU can get together and discuss their research or the interesting things they're doing. And here we are. So that's kind of, and I want to start off by thanking everyone for coming. I really appreciate this. I appreciate y'all's attendance. I will just real quick plug our our next speaker who will speak at this colloquium. It will probably be in March. We were originally thinking April. This maybe a surprise for my co-conspirator. But we will have one more colloquium this semester, and a scholar, Manuela Borsone. She's a scholar from Wesleyan, Nebraska. She will be coming up here. She specializes in Argentinian gaucho Western genres. So if you like Westerns or you want to know what a gaucho is, please come back. So now, without further ado, I am going to introduce John now. John, I'm not on social media. I'm looking at my notes for his introduction, just so you know. John is a historian of Eastern Europe. He has man, he has published extensively. He is especially he's published a lot of translations of novels. He has translated 10 Serbian novels, 2 Bosnian novels, a Croatian novel, 2 Hungarian. These are all book-length translations, I guess I should say. This is according to my information here. You've translated from the Slovene and the German, and I'll let you know as a translator myself, this is very impressive. He has also won awards for his translations, and he recently won the, the Literary Translator of the Year for the Serbian Pen Center in Belgrade. So congratulations. I know this was recent, and I know this was for a novel that is kind of your crown jewel, I guess you could say, of your translations. So, yeah. And of most worthy note, I just need to mention, I'm going to now, without further ado, most importantly, Katie, his wife, is on my curling team. So, go ahead, John. Take it away.
Thank you, Heath. Hi, folks. It's a lot of fun to be the inaugural speaker for this new colloquium, and it's an honor, and it's also a lot of fun for me to get to talk about the Balkans at any time, as my students know. If I'm not giving some digression about Vienna, it's some digression about Belgrade, and they're used to that. That said, most of my students don't know about this other life that I have as a literary translator, so now's your time to find out. My colleagues, many of y'all have heard about it, but you haven't seen much evidence of it, or, we talk about history, we don't mostly talk about translation. So today there'll be some glimpses into these other things that I fill my days with. First of all, my thanks to Greg, the proprietor of this venerable bookshop. Greg, if you're still in the room, thank you for making this back room available to us. This is a unique setting, y'all. This is a great location, and it's the finest bookstore in the Dakotas. So, come back sometime. And thank you to Tom Isern and Heath Wing for conceiving of this series. Thanks to all my colleagues who are here. I see bunches of you from the department and from other parts of campus. And many of my students, including some former students, and my son, who I will not identify, but he's here. So this is awesome. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. The title of the talk today is Should Historians Translate? And the answer is yes. So there we go. We're done. We're done. Enjoy the wine. I'm going to have some. As a matter of fact, we should and we do. Most historians translate, and I don't mean to be cagey with my response to this, but historians translate, if you're not an Americanist, anyway, just kidding, you translate all sorts of things. You read in foreign languages as a grad student and as a researcher, and you either learn through a foreign language or you're translating it in your head as you go. That's fine. But I have at least 2 colleagues who work actively in translation, Dr. Benton and Dr. Perrette, and I don't mean to leave anyone out, but Dr. Burt, hi Sean, works actively in translation as well. And all the language scholars who are here do the same thing. So yeah, we should translate, and we do, but there's a lot more to it from my angle from that. This today isn't going to be a book promotion, but as we've already said, it's the inauguration of a series. And it's my goal, and I think the goal of the founders of this colloquium, to open up a space to show us how the humanities can help us live lives in which passion and inspiration play major roles, right? And to show how the humanities, or the letters, or the liberal arts, whatever you want to call what we're doing here, how they interact with each other and cross-pollinate. This will be an interdisciplinary talk, and many of us do very interdisciplinary things. So here we go. When I was conceptualizing this talk, I thought I could go in one of 3 directions. With a title like that, having stuck myself with a title like that, now I could go in one of 3 directions. I could give you a show and tell about the 18 books of translation that I've published and all the individual pieces, which I haven't counted in a while. I could give you tales of woes with editors and weird rights holders and stubborn authors, but I'm not going to do that. It's not going to be a how-to talk, although you can ask questions about that if you want. I could take this in the direction, that ultimately is the most important to me personally, which is what have writers from the former Yugoslavia taught me about the former Yugoslavia? What have they taught me about how Yugoslavia worked? Not how it broke up or how it worked for so long, but how it functioned. Those of you who know me from class know that I specialize in 20th century history, especially communist countries, but also fascist movements. So I'm really interested in literary production as a source, not just as its own kind of production with its own genesis and reception, but as a source for understanding the daily lives of the people in these countries that I'm strangely fascinated with. But I decided to take this mostly in a third direction, which is a set of more general, if not quite theoretical, thoughts on how historical studies and the practice of translation are actually related. I believe, in an interdisciplinary way, that different fields of the humanities communicate with each other. They have cooperative relationships. They are mutually self-reinforcing. And I don't know, I think the most exciting thing I'll say today is when I talk in a few minutes about the common ground that historical study and translation occupy. So, when I ask, should historians translate, even rhetorically, I'm thinking of literature. Because we all, every time we read a foreign language newspaper, right, we're translating in our head, or we all use all kinds of sources. Specifically, in my case, I'm talking about literature. I wrote my dissertation on the foreign policy of Yugoslavia back in the early 90s was when I wrote the dissertation, which there could be nothing further from literary studies than non-aligned movement and Tito's constitutions, etc. But I've been translating now for just over 20 years because 9/11 happened, and there was a lot of interesting movement in literary circles in the U.S. to sort of, as the United States responded to 9/11, people were asking themselves, should we respond only with military force, or should we redouble our efforts to understand the world and why parts of it hate us so much, or how we can actually find common humanity, etc. I think I had done one translation, a Slovene short story, before 9/11 happened. But then I got a call, more likely an email. Again, those of you who know me know I can't even find my phone. So how could it have been a call? It was probably an email from an editor in New York, one of the only big editors that I know. And she said, we're starting a new publication. It's called Words Without Borders. You should all check this out. It's a fantastic website. And we're looking for this, that, and the other. And she talked about the 9/11 thing. And then she said, what do you have in the pipeline? I said, nothing. I'm a historian struggling. I think I had just gotten tenure at that point. And she said, get us something. We want to publish it. And I'm like, You know, and as you know, anybody who's an academic or a grad student will know, when someone offers you a shoehorn into a publication, you say yes. You say, how high should I jump? So anyway, that's sort of how it started, and then it picks up its own momentum because I've been lucky. I mean, German was the first foreign language I studied. That was in 9th grade, which is no big deal. Everybody studies languages in Europe in elementary school, in the U.S. in high school. But it kind of grew, and I kept acquiring languages, and I was in grad school forever, so I had plenty of time to learn languages, and I've lived in Europe a lot, so I got to have fun with languages. I decided I wanted to spend a chunk of my career and a gallon or two of my professional fuel into this area of literary translation. Because I love literature and I love history, but I wanted to do something different. And I wanted to do something besides sit in an archive. And I wanted to do something that foregrounded my languages, which bring me a lot of pleasure, but also it was kind of an homage originally to my parents, who are now both gone, but they had they were both really into language themselves, and they both really, really pushed me and rewarded me for language study and really wanted me to do this. So I thought, this will be cool. I'll do this for a while and see where it goes. And it has taken on this enormous, roaring tsunami life of its own, which is fun. It's great. And I hope it's meaningful. Anyway, so what I do when I say, translate, let's talk about translation. What I do is, well, like anybody, I write standard history articles, but mostly today they are in the field of intellectual history, which is one of the many, many subfields of the historical trade, right? When I was a graduate student, I didn't do intellectual history. I did political history, and I did diplomatic history. And I ended up writing a biography because the war in Yugoslavia had come, and it was no longer feasible to do the original foreign policy study that I had wanted to do. But intellectual history is the study of ideas as they evolve. Right? It's not just the absolute value study of ideas. Intellectual history is ideas in interaction with individuals and institutions. Students, you know my mnemonic devices, right? This is Ashley's nodding her head. All the I's, right? Ideas interacting with institutions and individuals. And as far as literature is concerned, these are texts, right? Literary works are texts. Now, they are artistic texts, and they have different standards of evaluation and interpretation that we have to respect. But they are also useful sources for following ideas. The ideas come out, again, in the genesis of the works and in the reception of the works, but I'm especially interested in the ideas in the works and the ideas embodied in the biographies of the people who write these works. That's just a long way of saying, or getting to the point of, how do I know when I want to translate a book? I mean, I'm not a commercial translator, right? I don't have to translate anything. I could just read it and use the stuff, use my ideas, and I'll talk later about why I don't just do that. I do that with some things. But again, I want to use the languages, I want to use these texts, but I pick books to focus on for intellectual history that are either controversial at the time or that are extremely rich in ideas. So maybe they're not always the greatest novels because, to some extent, sorry, Sean, modernist novels all read alike in some way. Sorry, Heath, or, they don't read alike, but you can elide a lot of the differences when you're looking at it under a genre rubric, and that's not what I do, right? I'm looking at the content of these books in terms of its ideas, of their ideas. So I pick a book that may be a neglected gem, it may be semi-forgotten, it may be in need of what some friends in the English department call recovery, which is a great thing to be part of. But I only translate the book if I love it. Why not? I'm not a commercial translator, right? NDSU pays my salary, and it's dependent upon a whole bunch of things. Teaching my classes and publishing regularly and doing service. And I hang out in Belgrade, for instance, when I go with a lot of writers, but I'm not translating their works. I'm basically mining them for ideas. And these are my friends now, so we do a lot of stuff. But I'm not translating the latest, greatest. I'm not looking for, a Serbian book to translate for Oprah's reading circle, right? I mean, Oprah's book club's awesome, but they'll get somebody else will translate the latest, greatest Serbian writer. I'm translating, I don't call them historical novels because that's a clouded and crowded and boring term. Novels that are important in the history of Yugoslavia, but that may not be on the tip of everyone's tongue. And I look long and hard. And like right now, I'm sort of between projects, right? I've got 2 little projects going on, but I have hit upon some really big projects, and they've almost all worked out, and they've almost all been well received. And in Serbia, which amazes me, it's great fun to say, they say, where are you from? And I say Fargo, and they say, is that a real place? No, because they've all seen the movie, but they're like, it's a real place? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, you have a university there? And I'm like, yeah. And we have a humanities colloquium. We have everything. Right. So I translate a book when you may get $500 for translating a book, by the way. You may get $1,000 for translating a book. I will just go ahead and tell you this, just so you know this is not some lucrative side gig that I do. The most I have ever been paid for a literary translation was $1,500. Ever. These things can take a year if it's a really complex novel, right? This is obviously a labor of love. It's also scholarship the way I do it. So this is not a way, to supplement income so much as the honoraria are given by the publishers, and it's important, I think, to work within that system, because there are people who are commercial translators who rely on those honoraria to pay their rent, right? So I don't run around doing a bunch of stuff for free. I may do one or two small things for a friend, but you know, I try to work with publishers when, so maybe I'm in love with a book. Maybe I've translated a chapter for myself to see how it goes, or a chapter to give to students to run up the flagpole in a class and see how it goes. But I don't want to publish it outside sort of the guild system, because there are people who really need that guild system, and as I say, fortunately I get paid a different way. But so let me switch gears a little bit and propose to you a couple of ideas. Why might historians be good at translating literature? Historians are good at translating all kinds of things. My three colleagues do all sorts of things that they translate with. But I think historians, especially with literature, with modern novels, let's say fiction. I don't translate poetry, by the way, except under duress. I have, but it doesn't really fit my working model. Why might historians be good at this? First of all, we know the languages. That might seem obvious, but we should revel in that fact as historians. Everyone should know more than one language, frankly, especially everyone who works at a university. But we know the languages. We keep our languages active by reading newspapers online, by going to conferences, by looking at primary sources, by talking with colleagues over coffee. But if we know the languages, let's revel in it. Let's roll up our sleeves and look for ways to make an impact, to get more mileage out of those languages. All right. Number two, I would submit that historians know the material, culture, geography, and historical context of a whole bunch of literary works. Not necessarily a huge deal, because literature is different from history. It is an experience, as my buddy Dr. Burt says. And again, different rules of excellence apply from fiction. Fiction is not just history with a bigger vocabulary, all right? It's a different kettle of fish. But we've all been reading, well, have you ever read a translation and noticed a weird historical term that they translated wrong? And it's not a huge deal. It's corrected in the second edition, or they said put a footnote, but the editor should have caught it. Like, I saw one recently. I was reading something Hungarian in translation, actually in English, and they referred to something called the Vienna Prizes. And some of my students may recall in 1938 and 1940, the Vienna Awards. Well, award and prize is the same word in a lot of European languages. But no historian would call what Hitler did in 38 and 40 the Vienna Prizes. They were the Vienna Awards. It was territorial transfer to win Hungary over to the Axis. So those are the kind of mistakes that historians don't make. And it's good to avoid those mistakes. So maybe that's a minor thing, but it's in there. A third reason historians might want to translate fiction is because we have a ready spot to use it. Our classes, right? And again, I don't really, my students here will attest to this. I don't make y'all read my stuff. I mean, that, but I did translate, I remember 20 years ago, I translated an essay about the Spanish Civil War. Actually, that was more than 20 years ago. So maybe I've been translating longer than since 9/11. Anyway, this was an essay from 1938 by a Slovene Christian socialist named Edvard Kocbek. And it's one of the best things I've ever translated. It was called The War in Spain. And it got him in endless trouble in interwar Yugoslavia. He was not a communist, he was a socialist, but he was a devout Roman Catholic, and he was watching the Spanish Civil War and global reactions to it, and he saw how polarized world opinion was. If you support the Republic, then you must be some kind of atheistic, Bolshevik, nun disinterring church burner. But if you support the church, then you're also supporting Franco and fascism. So where do you come down as your average Central European Christian? Well, Kocbek wrote this incredible essay about that, and about how he works through all of the arguments, the penalties, the biblical injunctions, the social teaching, and at the end he says, I'm a Christian and I support the Republic. And I thought it was wonderful. And I was teaching at a Catholic university at the time, so I shared that with students. Students ate it up. They're like, did you translate this? I'm like, yeah. They're like, from what language? I said, from Slovene. And they're like, is that a language? I said, yeah, it's a language. And this Kocbek guy was really cool. Anyway, this Kocbek went on to become, his nickname in the former Yugoslavia is the conscience of Yugoslavia, because he didn't become an outright dissident like an Alexander Solzhenitsyn or something, but He was often banned for his hard questions and for his thoughtful answers. And he eventually broke with the communists, even though he wasn't a communist. His party had been in coalition with them. He broke with them because of some unconscionable things they were doing. He remained true to his faith despite shifting political and historical currents, and I just thought that was fantastic, right? So occasionally when you find something like that, you want to share it with students, and you certainly can. But there are two other reasons why I think historians might be good at translating fiction and trying to publish fiction. The first of these final two is that we're outsiders in the literary trade. We're outsiders, right? We understand theory, but we seldom use it. We can barely quote it, and we're not up on the latest theoretical developments. I mean, I've read Andrea Dworkin, and I've read Edward Abbey, and I can quote a few people, but it's not an active part of what I do. But we understand it. We're welcome in the discussions, but we have a certain freedom to bust canons or to ask questions that other people might be embarrassed to ask. Or we can rescue a book and we can say, I think we should be talking about Biljana Jovanovic even though she's not in the canon, or even though she hasn't passed theoretical muster yet, because, and we'll introduce extra literary reasons for dealing with these texts. And I go to a lot of conferences where sometimes I'm the only historian in the room. Not usually, but it can happen, right? And it's a lot of fun to be the leaven in the mass, or to mix things up. Even while our goal is not to be, creative disruptor. Tom, this line's for you. Our goal is not to break it up and sell it for parts. Our goal is to learn and be phosphorescent, right? Be phosphorescent and see how the room looks. The final reason that we might be good at translating fiction is, again, we're outsiders, but yet in another way. We're outsiders because publication and placement of these texts isn't a life and death matter for us. Now, this might sound weird. It might sound smug. I realize there's privilege, great privilege, in being a tenured professor. Okay? I can have failures, and I can still pay the rent, right? I have many projects. I have the time to do many projects because I'm not flipping burgers or translating people's driver's licenses and documents for commercial translation. I realize all that. But there are a lot of great things in the world that deserve to be read by multiple language groups, right? And the more of those things that get into circulation and get discussed, the richer we all are and the better off we all are. So I want to say I don't care how much my books sell, except they're not my books, they're the author's books. And also, Dr. Kelly is in the room, and Indie Issue Press published one of my translations, so I really care how much this book sells right here. This could have been a simple story by Ayla Terzic. Buy it, it's fantastic. It's a Bosnian love novel. But in general, right, I mean, I don't have an agent, right? So I can't publish with Houghton Mifflin or Simon & Schuster. They don't know who I am, FSG. They get a translator when they need it. They have a little set of court translators. But I go to a university press or more of an artistic press like Dalkey Archive, or a lot of the new presses that are being formed, or small presses that I tend to find and latch onto because they're convenient vehicles with lovely, smart people. And they're very happy to talk about publishing translations. So it's not only is it not done for commercial gain, even though money makes the whole process easier, it doesn't. If you only translate books that are going to make the New York Times bestseller list, then we're all going to be reading the exact same books, right? And I'm talking about novels that are important historically. These aren't summer airplane reads or detective novels or, bodice rippers or poolside novels. There's nothing, all reading is good reading, right? And sometimes a book that's like that becomes a classic. Even in Yugoslavia, they had those. I did translate a generational, what's been called a cult novel in Yugoslavia. And it was actually the hardest book I ever translated because it was written in very, very strange 1970s slang from a particular social group, and it was quite hard. But that's never going to be canonical, but it had such huge footprints in history, I thought it was worth it to translate. So, maybe they'll sell 500 copies. All I care about is that libraries get these books, above all, and, occasionally some emigre gets it from his grandma for a Christmas present, or whatever. All right. So, let me move on. So sometimes I hear, or I don't often hear, sometimes I ask myself, or I wonder when I am going to hear, questions like this. Oh, okay, I did hear this one. This question is from I gave a 2-hour question and answer period about my work at this strange writers retreat in Serbia last September. And there was a historian there. I know this guy from way back. We're actually friends, but he thinks I spend too much time on literature and not enough on history. I'm exposing myself here. And he said, why do you retreat in literature? And then he backed up and he goes, why do so many historians today retreat into literature and linguistics? And I think what he was referring to is the linguistic turn, or the, using post-structuralism in your academic work, et cetera, none of which has any connection to what I do. And I told him, no one's talking about a retreat away from history here. We're talking about mobilizing new sources for history. I said, history is history, and novels don't tell us history. Novels produce texts that are useful as we compile the record of interpretation and causality that is history. Right? So no one's, he was under the impression, Mr. Petrovich was, that historians are giving up because it's so hard to take a stand, or everybody assails you when you say the wrong thing about whatever happened in 1944 or on January 6th, and we're afraid of truth, and so we retreat into literature. And I said to him over and over, no, it's not a retreat. It's analysis of new texts so that we can ask new questions and tap into new sources. So then sometimes, here's another question I sometimes ask myself, or wonder if other people will ask themselves or me this. Can't you just use these texts without publishing them? And again, it's a fair question, right? It's a fun question. Sure, of course. I use texts all the time that I don't publish. I mean, I can't translate everything. Right? I mean, why would you? So you consult vast numbers of books in any research project, whatever your field. It's when you love a book and you think that other people might love it too because of the doors that it opens into this culture. That's when I want to translate it. A book that, not a coffee table book, here are the ways in which, Austrians are different from Germans. Right? Or here's the way in which the Serbs are really stubborn and sometimes homicidal. I mean, nobody wants generalizations, what I call coffee table books, cheap anthropology. No, nobody wants that, right? We're talking books that offer meaningful insight because they're generated by people living in these societies about the struggles, the feelings, the unanswered questions that they had. These are windows. Like any good book, a novel can bring us a chunk of the world that we can't see, or that is gone, or that we don't have a ticket or a visa for, or that we don't want to go visit because of COVID, or whatever, right? Books bring us stuff. And so when I find a book that I think offers people an enormous experience, intellectual especially experience, that's when I want to translate it. I don't feel like translating everything. And the final sort of big idea. How am I doing on time, Dr. Cooley?
You got 5 minutes.
Okay. That's the early warning sign, though. I built in an extra 5 minutes beyond that. But don't worry, we're almost done. I would love some questions after this. And I have a couple of, juicy readings from 2 of my recent translations I thought I would close with. So, what's the relationship, then, to get down to cases, between this kind of literary translation that I'm talking about and intellectual history? I've defined intellectual history, kind of working definition there, ideas in interaction with institutions and individuals. So these literary works, The Cherry Tree by Yuri Koch, recently published by the digital press at UND, Dogs and Others by Istros Books, which is probably my favorite translation, but definitely the book that I am most glad that I think this is the most important book I've ever translated, ever. I have to be careful where I say that because I've translated some, brilliantly and canonically beloved people in Serbia, and it's not a zero-sum game, right? They're all good. You're just better, right? But this is the most important book I've ever translated. So these literary works are texts, and texts are artifacts, and artifacts are primary sources, and primary sources have contexts. And that's where the history comes in. The ideas in the books and the context of the author's life, the genesis of the books, and the reception history of the books. In any one of those four pockets, you can operate, I believe, as an intellectual historian. It's funny, a couple of years ago, I was at a conference in Belgrade, and the professor introducing me used a phrase for me that I had never heard before. She said, Dr. Cox is a literary historian. And I thought, wow, that's not on my transcript. But what if this is on my transcript, right? It's not in my job description, but I mean, it's just historian, right? But and then I've been called a philologist, and then I've been called an enthusiast, an out of control enthusiast. I've been called all sorts of things, but philologist is not a word that works well in North America, so I'll go with intellectual historian or literary historian. But these are artifacts, and they have context, and that's where we work. There's the teaching function, which I talked about. But so what do I do with these texts when I translate them? And if you're interested in how translation works, feel free to ask, but I won't go into that. I don't want to go overboard here. It's fun. Translation is great fun. I haven't translated yet today. I'm getting peevish. All right? I'm only going to have one glass of wine after this because I want to go home and translate. All right. You think I'm kidding. No, I'm not. So one of the things that I do I've published 18 books. The 18th is in press now. 16 of those were works of literature. I did 2 nonfiction books. Why? For the money. It wasn't a lot of money, but my son will recognize the fact one of these. My daughter wanted to go to French camp one summer at Concordia Language Villages, and we didn't have the money. So I translated a book. It's a book of history. It's called Coca-Cola Socialism. It's in our library. It's a fantastic book of Yugoslav history. The author contacted me, said, we got this. It's a great university press that put it out, and it's going to be this much. And I'm like, I don't usually I just do fiction. I mean, I'm privileged enough. I'm not saying I'm powerful or rich or smart. I'm saying I'm in this position where I've got this passion, and what I want to do is do fiction because I love fiction, and I've got these unique ways of processing it, but I need the money, so fine, I'll do it. It's a great book. It's about the influence of American pop culture on communist countries in the 1960s and 70s, from the musical Hair to Bob Dylan and right up to Austin Powers, basically. It's wonderful. So, for the 2 books of nonfiction that I have translated, I did not do this step that I'm trying to tell you about. I did not write an introduction. I didn't feel that I didn't want to take away as a historian writing about another historian's work. There's a different forum for that, and I didn't feel called to, actually, because these weren't books. Well, I mean, we're talking about humanity's inspiration and passion. These weren't books that I loved. I liked them enough to translate. I'm not going to translate, well, there are lots of things I won't translate. Biographies of, Serbian oligarchs, for instance. Every Serbian oligarch now has a biography written, like the biggest oligarch in Serbia is made his money by selling laundry detergent. It's a lot less exciting than Russian oligarchs who form paramilitary groups and invade neighboring countries. But the Serbian oligarchs sell laundry detergent. And they'll have some, ghostwriter write their autobiography, or some out-of-work regular writer write their biography, and then they find an American to translate it. And I know a number of Americans who translated these books. I'm like, no, I don't have. All right. Anyway, where was I going with this? But I picked these 2 books that I did really like, these nonfiction works, but I didn't write an introduction. For the 16 literary works that I've translated, mostly novels, some short, a variety of stuff, I've always written an introduction. That's all I meant to say. I always write a historical introduction or afterword. And as a matter of fact, when a contract comes from a publisher, I don't sign it unless they put in the contract that I'm allowed to write and that they will publish the historical afterword, or not just the translator's preface, which is a given. You get to tell how to pronounce weird diacritical marks, blah, blah. And then you dedicate your translation to somebody. But I write a significant afterword. Sometimes these are 2,000 words, sometimes they're 10,000 words. But that is an effort to contextualize. It's the historian in me interacting with that text. I present schools of interpretation that already exist with footnotes, and I add my own, and I tell what I think the historical value of this work is, etc. I will also comment on literary controversies or innovations, but that's not the primary focus. They are really historical afterwards for these books. So that's one way I make sure that the historian in me gets to take a swing at these things. Another thing that I do in those introductions, and that I have done in another way I use the text, is called, I call it my engagements. I will often work on a single writer for multiple translations. I mean, okay, Danilo Kish, who is the biggest author, most famous author I have ever translated. Danilo Kish is the greatest writer to come out of communist Yugoslavia. He died in 1989. He was a fantastic writer, right on the verge of late modernism and postmodernism. He wrote a lot about the Holocaust. He also wrote about Stalinism. Most of his family died either as slave laborers in the Hungarian army on the Eastern Front or at Auschwitz. I've translated 6 works of his, and he is canonical. He is huge. It was a great stroke of luck to get the first Kish, and then I met his 2 former wives, and they supported my work, and they're very gracious, and it's been wonderful to write on him. But I also wrote several articles about Kish. The other engagement, the other 2 engagements, there's an Albanian writer whose works I've been in love with for decades. His name is Ismail Kadare. Now, I don't work with Albanian, right? I've never studied Albanian, but all of Kadare's works are translated instantly by his court translators into French. And actually, I learned French just for the purpose of working on Kadare. At my old university, I went to the French classes, and I hung out in Quebec whenever I could. And I learned, everybody knows a little French, right? But I really worked it up, and I actually published a translation of one of his short stories. It's on Words Without Borders from the French. But I wrote 6 or 7 articles on Kadare because he was so huge and he had written so much, and there was so much out there. So different intellectual topics that come out of his fictional works, blending with material I found in his interviews and his journalism and all kinds of stuff. And then I have a 3rd engagement that hasn't grown as big as the first 2, but it's with the Serbian writer Biljana Jovanovic, in whose work I am deeply in love in a strange way, with whose work I'm deeply in love. I've done 2 of her novels, and I'm under contract for her 3rd novel right now, and I've written a couple of articles about her, but that's still got places it can go. So in these articles, like in the shorter introductions that I write, one of the techniques I use, I haven't found a really cool, pithy name for this technique yet, but so for today I came up with seedbeds of social history questions. Studying literature as a historian, for non-literary purposes, let's say, we don't necessarily find answers to historical questions in novels. Again, I want to stress, no one responsible here in the room is saying that you should give your students the novel Schindler's List by Thomas Keneally and use that as a textbook for the Holocaust. That novel is mostly historically accurate. It's a fantastic novel. It's a fantastic movie, right? But that's not a history book. It's a novel. And so liberties are taken, things are left out, cause and effect are left unexamined. It's different, right? It's different. So no one is confusing these things. But what I find is not answers in literary works, but questions. So the reason I love Dogs and Others so much by Jovanovic is because I had never read a novel, and I don't think most Yugoslavs had ever read a novel like this when it came out in 1980, that examines everything from sexual harassment and workplace rape to elder care, suicide, horrific medical system, public transportation, drug abuse, venereal disease, art openings, and visa problems. I mean, it's got this whole world of, I won't even say it's the demi-monde of 1970s Belgrade. It's life. It's life in a big city, and it's not the kind of stuff you usually find written in communist countries. And when I read this, I was absolutely fantastically blown away. And when I analyzed this book, I use it as I have not written I mean, you could easily write an entire social history on urban life just based on the questions from this book. I have not done that. Why? Well, I teach a lot. I love teaching. And I also moving on to other translations. But someday, like when I retire, or in 1 second, I'm going to tell you the big books that I do have planned on some of these as building blocks. There are all kinds of wonderful questions. Was the medical system significantly different from rural to urban areas? Well, one suspects yes, but that question comes out of here. What is it? How can some families afford a home care health keeper and others can't if it's a socialist country? Should this be, how did that play out? What did people think of those differences in the healthcare system? All kinds of great stuff. One could also look at biography, reception history, etc., international movements, affiliations of writers. In other words, it's wide open because these are texts. And when you recognize, appreciate, respect the difference between fiction and nonfiction, what I'm really after is non-fictional historical contribution to historical discourse, but you can use these in the same way that you can use any other texts, and hopefully by translating them create some memorable experiences for readers, open up some doors. Everybody knows if you're taking a history class, often the novels are fun, or your professor wants the novels to be fun, to illustrate certain historical points, right? My Russian history students are about to read this incredible novel by a Russian woman writer, Lydia Chukovskaya. The novel's called Sofia Petrovna. It's a novel about Stalin's purges. But I think the name Stalin comes up twice in it. And the whole thing is about a single mom in St. Petersburg and what happens to his son after he graduates from high school. It's this very quiet, gentle introduction, unsuspecting introduction to the horrors of the Great Terror of 1936 to 1938. So you can teach and illustrate things with these. I didn't translate that, obviously. That's another. I mean, it's a fantastic book, though. And this is what I think I'm hoping for when I find these things. So, if I had 1 million years left in my life and 1 million hours in every day, here are 3 books that I would write. I started a book a long time ago on the works of Ismail Kadare, this great Albanian writer. And I was writing that book when I came here. And I didn't finish that book because being department head was too difficult. And I was spending my time on other things. But someday I would like to go back to that unfinished book on Kadare and finish it. Some publishers are still interested. The publisher that had been interested is no longer interested. But, we learn to live with bumps in the road because no one's perfect. And students who get told to edit your essays, don't worry. Everybody has to edit. Everybody. And sometimes you lose sight of objectives and you lose a publishing contract. All right. Another book that I want to write that is actually embedded in the Fulbright proposal that I'm being considered for right now. I'm a finalist for another Fulbright. Is called States of Change, or Translating the Serbian Experience through History and Culture. I want to write a history of translations from Serbian into English and why they were chosen by talking to publishers, and there have been a few series, etc. You can count the number of people who've translated Serbian novels into English on 2 hands, and I know a lot of them. So this would be a fun, and some of them have passed on, but and I want to suggest a slate of books that should be translated from Serbian in the future. Not commercial bestsellers, but books that would really open doors for people who give a blank about that part of the world. And then a final book that for a long time was the only book I said I would write in my retirement from Portugal in a few years. It's something like between. It's hokey. between dissonance and dissidence, or something like that. Because I've noticed I have this trend, something that connects a lot of the writers I have worked on, is the fact that most of them were not political dissidents, right? And I joke with everybody, I say not everybody can be a Solzhenitsyn or a Havel, right? The world needs Alexander Solzhenitsyns and Václav Havels, but not every great writer finds him or herself in a position to do that, or even wants to do that. Ismail Kadare, this great Albanian writer, is much more like a Shostakovich. There are all kinds of parallels that you can draw cautiously. Shostakovich, the Soviet composer, who danced in and out of favor, kept his head on his shoulders, produced wonderful work, produced trashy work at times just to stay alive and keep the paychecks coming. Kadare did the exact same thing in Albania, and you can find that in other countries too. But my point is, like the people in between literary experimentation and political dissidence, people who become revolutionary through sort of a French 19th century, almost Baudelairean way of becoming revolutionary by changing the way people express themselves. And that has political ramifications. So there's subtle political dissidence, but this person, Jovanovic, would not fit. She's not subtle, right? But Danilo Kiš's experiments, this one that came out from the UND outfit recently, Juri Koch, this is my first German novel in translation. He's a much more quiet kind of dissident who's not just letting the work speak for itself, but it's the themes as well as the style of the work that make him revolutionary and to some extent transgressive. So those are longer term projects I have in mind. Do I have time to give a brief reading, or should we switch to question and answer mode? Y'all want to hear a brief passage? Okay. The Serb or the Sorb. Juri Koch is a member. He's from Germany, but there is a 70,000 strong Slavic minority inside Germany called Sorbs. I'm not kidding. S-O-R-B. Serb, Sorb. Sorbs. Sound like Serbs win. All right. Maybe we'll have time for. All right. So. Very good, Dr. Von. I agree. So Dogs and Others was written in 1980, and it's about a young 20-something woman in the capital city of Yugoslavia, Belgrade. She's a college graduate. She works kind of as a librarian at a factory. Factories all had libraries in socialist Yugoslavia, and workers were always given books, instead of a watch or a pen or a keychain that you might get for your 10th anniversary at NDSU or something. In all the communist countries, they gave you books with a nice big stamp in the front, and it's wonderful. But her name is Lydia, and she's in this messed up family. Her brother Danilo has a learning disability and is almost housebound and bedridden. He kills himself in a horrific way in the mental hospital at the end of the book. There is no light at the end of this tunnel in this book. My wife, who couldn't be here today, she says, John, it's not a real novel because there's absolutely zero hope in it. She said, it's just this Philippic, it's just this Jeremiah, it's not a real novel. And I said, whoever said anything about happy endings? It's got a plot, and it's a novel. All right, anyway, Lydia, this is also the... how to describe it? The first lesbian novel ever written or published in Yugoslavia, or my publisher chose to put it this way: the heroine of Dogs and Others is the first openly lesbian character in modern Serbian literature. Okay, and there's some interesting love scenes, if that makes you want to read this book. All of which are translated, of course. Anyway, this is a scene of. So in this, she lives in this multi-generational family. She lives with her grandma Jaglika, who is of Hungarian extraction. Serbs are a mixed. Well, Yugoslavia was a very mixed bunch, right? And her brother is Danilo, and Jaglika is dying. The grandma. The month of May is not exactly the greatest time to die, or especially to be buried. This novel is supposed to hit you like a ton of bricks, right? It just comes at you. It's just the throttle. The pedal is to the metal, and most of it's bad news. But anyway, It's not exactly the greatest time to die, or especially to be buried. Jaglika, that's Grandma, spent the whole night dying, horribly slowly. Danilo was sitting in his room, that's her brother. He would show up periodically and ask, and keep on asking, is that her soul, Lydia, those little white bubbles? Or, surely that's her soul, right, Lydia? What else could there be that's white like that? Give her some water. Can't you see she's thirsty, Lydia? He came back every half hour to look at Grandma. Not yet. Those little bubbles are still coming out. And he looked amazed. He seemed to be off his rocker. Damn it. Jaglika and I passed the entire night, in fact, alone. I should have left her in peace. At first she was just a little yellow, and then later she was yellow all over. And by morning she was dead. She was with God, completely white and totally pure. For days before that she'd been repeating, I never did anything nasty to anybody. And Danilo tried to cheer her up. Baba, stop it with those stories about sin, your sin. How did that one curse go in Hungarian you used to say? Come on, Granny. What was that curse in Hungarian? Fuck you and your copper angel whistling on 7 weeping willows, Granny? Was that it? Was that, were you whistling or playing the flute? Eh, Baba? But Jaglika, who had long since forgotten the language of her mother, would say, not 7 but 10. Do you understand, Danilo? 10 willows. And Danilo, bustling around the rocking chair, holding his half-dead grandmother, said stubbornly, come on, Baba, say it in Hungarian. Please, Granny. Jaglika, I love all the multicultural stuff. Serbs are good at that. Jaglika wasn't paying attention to the fact that everybody was asking her, the real angels and the souls of the dead, to just speak Hungarian, and then to think back and tell us about things from the time when she had 2 or 3 shops. They were a family of merchants originally. They had moved from the Hungarian part down to Montenegro once Yugoslavia was created, and then the family moves back to Belgrade. Tell us about the things from the time when she had 2 or 3 shops. It couldn't be worthwhile, and I wouldn't even be worth it. And it wouldn't even be worth it to hear Danilo's make one curse in his mother's language, in her language. Jaglika counted off her sins on the fingers of both of her clenched hands as if she were totting up the receipts from the last 2 hours at her shop down in Nikšić, or as if she were stacking groceries on the shelf opposite the door in that same store. In the morning, when she was dead, she had the face of an embryo. Everything was erased by the hand of a copper angel and by the hand of Jesus on the wall. The coroner, that graveyard doctor, arrived pulling on a pair of transparent gloves. He turned the stiff, deceased, having now been introduced to this God and that one, and now angelic Jaglika first onto one side of her body and then the other, like a small planed tree trunk. He unbuttoned her shirt, felt for her pulse through her breast, and then flipped her over on her back and tapped 2 or 3 times with his fingers. Danilo said over and over from the doorway, that's the brother again, be careful, she'll break. I mean it, for God's sake, watch out. Then the coroner sprinted off to the bathroom, tripping over his own feet, washed his hands, threw the plastic bag gloves on the floor, pressed a piece of paper with an official stamp on it into Danilo's hand, saying that Jaglika died a natural and not a violent death, and left, taking 2 steps at a time on his way down. Before his visit, I had washed Jaglika and dressed her. Cheda, that's their home health care assistant that they can somehow afford, Cheda helped me. He had come half an hour after getting Danilo's phone call. He was panting and growling. My God, is she heavy. Danilo lugged the wash bowls in and out, muttering fretfully every time, is there really more, Lydia? What is this? Meanwhile, the vital fluids just kept pouring out of Jaglika, and after they placed her in the coffin, they kept on. Puddles remained on the bed. So, actually, they pay for the home health care aid from the mom. Notice I missed the mom's not here. There's the protagonist and her brother and the grandma. The mom is in Italy on her 8th or 9th husband and can't be bothered to deal with family affairs, including her dying mother. Her name is Marina. So all Marina did was send a telegram and send money by wire so that her mother would be buried where she wanted. But she said she wouldn't be able to come to the funeral because all the transport workers in the world were on strike. Bullshitter. But none of us knew where it was that her mother wished to be buried. Here, there, way over here. So Cheda suggested that I give him the money for everything and he would take care of all of it. Hunky-dory. So we had Jaglika cremated. There was no room for her under the earth here, and no room there, but only in the oven. The most random set of relatives then flooded into our house, blew through in perilous bursts, and one after another, they grew irate and started talking all this bullshit about Christianity, decent burials, just not like this, burning her up, and all the rest of it. So, questions about daily life under communism that have nothing to do with politics. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, some people are running out of time, but Dr. Eisner still has time. So, question? Happy to answer questions. Comments, brickbats? Yes, Dr. Cooley.
So I was wondering, how does the language tell you something different from the recitation of facts? So when you're talking about how you're doing this, history versus the literature, is there a difference in language that's you're looking at that actually gives you a different impression? With literature, you can get to truths and philosophy a different way from the philosophical argument. So I'm wondering if there's something like that for you.
That's a great question. That's a lovely thought. I have two partial answers to it. One is it's not the language so much as the breadth of experience that's in the books, right? So whereas you might not find a weekly news magazine or a Life magazine equivalent from the late great Yugoslavia might not ever run an article on home health care, AIDS, or sexual abuse at the dentist's office, or in an insane asylum, but you will find those issues addressed in fiction, which is much more personal and where people's emotional concerns are vented. So how would you find, especially if you're not living in that country or didn't live through that country, right? Where do we find the questions? Sometimes it's not how they're expressed, but just the fact that they are expressed, because the breadth of experience is so much greater in a novel. I had another half answer, but I forgot it. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, it's not necessarily the language. It's the topics that are brought up in the works. I'll think of the second half eventually. Carol.
I have about 5 questions, but the most specific is what is it like? What is access to publication for many of these writers? Is it, are there a lot of publishers, and do you only ever translate one that's been published, or have you ever taken on that in the process? And also, the fact that you translate some of these things, does it affect or open more doors, or that?
Mm-hmm. I have all of the books that I've been part of Englishing have been published in Serbian or other languages originally.
First.
First. I was in the archives once on a visit probably close to a decade ago now in Belgrade, and I found 2 unpublished manuscripts by this Danilo Kish. They were his. He had written 2 screenplays for movies that were never made, but they were complete. They were typed up. They were bound by little sticky European things, and I thought, holy smoke! So his plays had been published in Serbian. So then a day or 2 later, I was having coffee with his first ex-wife, his main ex-wife, and widow. And I said, "Did you know that in the archive downtown there are the 2 screenplays?" And she was like, and I don't think she didn't know me that well at the time, and I'm not sure she completely trusted me. So she's like, "Mm-hmm." So like 4 or 5 months later, I got a book in the mail, and it was those screenplays published in Serbian. Because I had mentioned to her, like, well, maybe that would be a neat thing for me to like do that. I didn't say do this instead of you publishing them, because she takes care of his legacy. Like Dr. Wing, does that sound familiar? Like the Scagliotta family, the widow taking care of the But she went ahead and published them, and I was very glad she did. So I did translate them in with his plays then, and that's one of the volumes that I've done. But typically it's only stuff that has been published. It is a wonderful thing what you describe about what George Steiner would call the reciprocity between a translation that appears an ocean or 2, a continent or 2 away, and the dialogue, the discussion that then has with the original text, right? And it's not just between the translator talking with. When I go to Belgrade, sometimes newspapers want to interview me, like, how did a guy from North Dakota discover this book, right? And I tell the same story 5 times, but it's, but it's more like just the texts themselves at some level are having this discussion because future readers are going to read and compare. Or it's not that anybody goes through it and says, oh, Cox did that one sentence brilliantly, but this noun is improperly done. I mean, typically you don't read translations that closely, right? But I'm framing this in a certain way with the introduction and the preface and the afterword, and I'm talking about it in a certain way in my historical writings, and that gets the conversation going with the original. And George Steiner, of course, was convinced that books are better after they've been translated. Even the original is better in some mystical way because it's another set of eyes that might not be our eyes, but that we benefit from. So that's a hopeful thought. Don, did you have a question? Was that you?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of disciplinary. Are there disciplinary barriers that you alluded to, kind of sometimes like being the only historian at these places, or like feeling out of place? Like, are there ever does that ever cause kind of like friction, or is it pretty collegial?
No, it's very collegial. It's extremely collegial. And I'm not usually the only historian, but I'm usually the only one from the Anglosphere, right, who is doing this much elaborate stuff with it. No, it's the interactions are appreciated. Certainly, I appreciate all the, accumulated knowledge as well as all the theory that the literary people have. Typically, the academics and their students, not to mention the families of these writers, are thrilled that somebody's looking at it in a different way. They tend to be thrilled. You can tell very early if a collaboration or if a project is not going to work. It's kind of interesting because last year was a big year for me because, as Heath mentioned, I won this award in Serbia, but it's also the first year that I got 2 major rejections for rights for some books that I wanted to do. And they're unique things, and it wasn't about me personally, at least one of them. Okay, so, I mean, maybe it was, but no. So one of the writers I really want to work on, and I think there's 2 of his novels that should be on the list of like 20 all-time great yet untranslated books from Serbia. His name is Mirko Kovac. He moved to Croatia when the Yugoslav War started in the early 90s, and he became a Croatian citizen, even though he was a Serb originally. And so the rights to all of his works are in Croatia with a Croatian publishing house. So, no problem. I mean, some of my best friends are Croats. It's fine. That was a joke. I found a publisher. Publisher found me who wanted to do a Kovac book. So usually if you have a publisher pretty much lined up and you're a translator who's halfway recognizable, it's not an issue. But the publisher in Zagreb just dawdled, and we sent, here's how we could help fund it, this, that, and the other. I did a sample, all this stuff, right? And, there's no Mirko Kovac in English, and it would just be something. I had a novel actually called Malvina, which is the name of a local person here in Fargo who our colleague Dr. Smith and Dr. Smith and Dr. Fellows have worked on a different Malvina, but it was a really cool novel. And finally the publisher just called me, or he said, John, I want to have a Zoom with you from Zagreb. I'm like, okay, Sayad, that's fine. What's up? And he goes, we're not going to let your publisher and you do this book. And he goes, I wanted to talk to you first because we admire your work, and but this publisher's too small time. And it's not a small time publisher. I mean, it's not FSG or Simon & Schuster, right? But it's a German publisher, and they do some English work now, and they're good. They're very scholarly. He's like, I'm talking this book around in New York, and we're going to propose you as the publisher. If you find a bigger publisher, meantime, let us know. But we're basically what he was saying is this guy's the goose that laid the golden egg, that he thinks. I mean, okay, Kovac has been dead for, 15, 20 years. Nothing of his is in English. He's not a goose laying golden eggs. He's a fine, fine writer and a man of strong conscience who took a lot of heat because he wasn't a nationalist freak during the wars. I felt like saying to this guy, you can wait as long as you want. And I mean, he's like, we think he might be the next Dunny Lokish. That's the exact phrase that this guy said to me. And all I didn't say this because I'm North Dakota nice now, you know, and because I want to have a working relationship with this guy, maybe. I just kept thinking, let me know how that works for you. Right? That's what I wanted to say. Because nobody's going to translate Kovacs. Anyway, I would have. And this good publisher, anyway. So that blew up in my face, and whatever. It's not like personal trauma or anything. But then I had another, I was going to apply for an NEA recently. I ended up not applying for it. Because I had found the perfect book, Serbian woman writer, like the first major Serbian woman novelist. I've done a lot of women writers from Serbia. Her name was Isidora Sekulic. She died familyless in 1958. But this is her master work, and it's almost in the public domain, but not quite, according to Serbian law. So I had to find out who has the rights to Isidora Sekulic. All right, that's fun. Dr. Wing is doing that now for some books he's translating from Brazil. And so first thing you do is you write to your friends who are publishers in Serbia. I happen to know. I have coffee with everybody when I go, right? So I wrote to Gojko and Željko, and I said, who, you know, and they're like, I don't know, this guy asked this professor, this guy. But the internet, it's super easy, email, Facebook, you find the publisher. All right. The rights to Sekulic's work, and she wrote about 10 or 12 major books, not all fiction, she wrote essays. The rights to this belong to a borough of the city of Belgrade. A borough, not even like Belgrade mayor's office, but like, it'd be like Osgood, it'd be like, not even Westford, like the Horace Town Hall has the rights to, So I try to get in touch with this municipal office. It's called an Opština. It's not the city. It's like a big neighborhood in the city, but they all have, you know, this is where you go like to, you know, get a residency permit or to pay your local tax. I don't know. And I didn't hear back. So I started reaching out. Again, the joys of the internet. I have a friend who lives in that same borough and who's a writer. So I wrote Laura and I said, next time you're down, you know, getting your tax stamp on your driver's license, could you ask them why they don't answer my emails? But she went down there right away and went back and they sent me these forms to fill out. All right. I didn't know the Serbs were so bureaucratic. I fill out all these forms. This is in November, December. The time for the NEA is approaching. I just want their permission. So the NEA had said, you don't have to have a publisher lined up to apply for this support, but you have to have clear permission from the rights holder that you may translate. I mean, usually, you can translate anything you want. You just can't publish it without permission. But if you're applying for an intermediary grant, sometimes they want the indication that you're serious and you've made the connections. Fine. I do this all the time, right? I didn't hear back. So I'm writing a second friend at this point, and they're both calling them. Finally, my friend Laura Facebooks me back. And she says, you're not going to believe this. She said, they're going to reject your claim because you didn't fill out the forms properly. And I said, may I refill out the forms? I'm not, you know, I don't know. No, she's like, no, you filled it out fine. You were very honest. She said, you are not registered as a corporation in Serbia. You personally. She said, you're not a, what's the term? You're an individual identity. You're an individual agent, you're individual whatever, you're matični broj. I needed to be either a Serbian person or a foreigner incorporated in Serbia to get the rights to do a translation of a 60-year-old novel. Now, so I wrote back and I said, there must be some misunderstanding. I'm not asking for the movie rights or something potentially lucrative, right? This is going to be a scholarly translation of this 300-page book that probably 8 people will read in English. They don't want this translated? And they're like, no, they want a Serb to translate it. And I'm like, well, why? How many Serbs can... I mean, there are Serbs who but typically your target language is your mother tongue and your source language is the cool one that you're working from, right? And it's like, And sure enough, a few days later, in email came the rejection with this long explanation. You did not follow paragraph 6.32, which says that in field A/G4, you must have entered the name of your Serbian corporation since you are not a Serbian person. And then she wrote in her hand at the bottom, handprint, "Thank you." And I'm just like, yeah, we're not doing this. We're not doing it. So I threw all my photocopies of related materials away. I'm cleaning out my office for those of you who haven't noticed, and I have to get rid of paper. So I'm like, well, this is not going to happen. So I don't know how I got off on that, except to say that, sometimes they don't work. Sometimes the projects don't work. Thank you very much for coming and putting up with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cox. We really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it. If y'all want to grab any more snacks before you leave, I know students are often hungry.
Students should graze.
Put them in your
Graze.
pockets if you want. That's okay. Thanks, Dr. Cox.
Thank you.
We do have copies of John's book published by NDSU Press.
So Dennis, that question.